Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Insomnia Forest. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story waiting for you. A story filled with mystery, fear, and things that should have remained hidden deep in the darkness. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. Now, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and get ready. Because tonight, we're stepping deep into the unknown. Let's begin. In 1984, I was still getting used to life as a ranger in Tennessee's Great Smoky Mountains. It wasn't exactly a place where you could take it easy and hope for a quiet shift. The park stretched over 500,000 acres of some of the oldest mountains on Earth, and every day brought something new. Lost hikers stumbling through dense rhododendron thickets, black bears getting too comfortable around campsites, or weekend warriors who thought they could tackle the Appalachian Trail in sneakers. I came from a long line of factory workers in East Tennessee. My father had spent 30 years on the line at the aluminum plant, coming home every evening with that dead look in his eyes that told me everything I needed to know about punching a time clock. I decided early on that I wasn't cut out for a 9-to-5 job like my dad. The open spaces and freedom of the outdoors were the only things that made sense to me, so naturally I ended up here, trading the steady paycheck of industrial work for the uncertainty and raw beauty of the wilderness. The pay wasn't great, but it beat breathing chemical fumes and watching the clock. At least that's what I told myself most days. As for making a career out of chasing lost hikers, babysitting rowdy campers, and pulling drunk tourists out of ravines, that was something I was starting to regret. I was stationed near a remote section of the park, far from the usual visitor spots, like Cades Cove or Cataract Falls. This was deep country, where the mountains folded in on themselves like a rumpled blanket, creating hollows and ridges that most people never saw. The area was known more for its quiet, dense woods than for anything particularly scenic. Most of my days were spent patrolling alone, keeping an eye on the wildlife and making sure nobody wandered off into parts of the forest where cell service didn't exist and common sense went to die. The work was solitary by nature. Park rangers worked as protectors of the public and the resources that were in the national park, acting not only as patrolmen, but also as curators of the park itself. In my sector, that meant long hours walking trails that rarely saw human traffic, checking for storm damage, monitoring illegal camping, and occasionally stumbling across the remnants of old moonshine operations from decades past. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My buddies in town used to joke that the only things more stubborn than me were the bears. They weren't wrong. The black bears in the Smokies had a reputation for being bold, and encounters were becoming more frequent as visitors increased. Still, in 1984, we were dealing with maybe 9 million visitors a year instead of the crushing crowds that would come later. I wasn't armed most of the time. The Park Service was strict about guns. They didn't want any trigger-happy rangers scaring off the tourists, or worse, accidentally shooting someone's kid who wandered too far from camp. We carried radios, first aid supplies, and the authority to write citations, but that was about it. For the most part, that seemed like enough. That particular morning in late September, I had a strange feeling. Nothing you could put your finger on, just a sense that something was off. The air felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. The usual sounds seemed muted. Fewer birds calling, less rustling in the underbrush. Even the ever-present hum of insects seemed subdued. I chalked it up to the changing weather. Fall was coming early to the mountains, and the first frost wasn't far off. I'd been patrolling the same route for 3 months, a 12-mile loop that took me through some of the most remote sections of the park. The trail wound through old-growth forest, past abandoned homesteads where families had lived before the park's creation, and along ridges that offered glimpses of the endless blue mountains stretching to the horizon. It was peaceful work, mostly, but it could be eerie, too. There were places where you could still feel the weight of all the people who had lived and died in these mountains over the centuries. People think they know the woods, but the truth is, no matter how long you've been out here, the forest always has ways of reminding you how little you really know. I'd been working the wilderness for over a year, and I was still learning things that surprised me. The way sound traveled differently depending on the humidity, how certain weather patterns could make animals behave strangely. The feeling you'd get sometimes that you were being watched, even when you knew you were alone. I was about 3 miles into my patrol, checking the trails for debris after a recent storm, when I spotted the cabin. I'd seen it before, an old hunter's shack, probably built in the 1800s, sitting deep in the woods where it would take a determined hiker to find it. The thing was falling apart with gaps in the chinking and a roof that looked like it might cave in with the next hard rain. No one used it anymore, not legally at least. It was the kind of place that attracted the occasional squatter or kids looking for a place to party away from adult supervision. But today, something was different. There was smoke rising from the chimney, a thin gray column that stood out against the cloudy sky. I stopped on the trail about 50 yards from the cabin and watched. The smoke was steady, not the intermittent puffs you'd expect from someone just trying to get a fire started. Someone had been there for a while. I pulled out my radio and keyed the mic. "Bay, this is Ranger Morrison. I've got possible squatters at the old hunter's cabin on the North Ridge, requesting backup for eviction." Static crackled back at me. "Copy, Morrison. What's your 20? I gave them my location and estimated time for other units to reach me. The response came back fuzzy, cutting in and out. Reception was always spotty in the deeper parts of the park, especially with the heavy cloud cover we'd been having. "Maybe an hour. Other units. Domestic situation in Cade's Cove." "Say again, base?" More static. Then nothing. I clipped the radio back to my belt and studied the cabin. The door was closed, and I couldn't see any movement through the grimy windows. Whoever was inside was being quiet about it. That could mean anything. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe they'd heard me coming and were hoping I'd go away. Or maybe they were long gone and had just left the fire burning. Standard protocol was to wait for backup when dealing with potential squatters. You never knew what kind of people you might be dealing with, and some of the locals who used the remote areas for illegal activities weren't exactly welcoming to authority figures. But I'd done this dance before. Most of the time, it was just homeless folks looking for shelter or teenagers who thought they'd discovered the perfect party spot. I approached the cabin slowly, keeping to the tree line at first. The building looked even more decrepit up close. The logs were gray with age and weather, and several of the windows were missing their glass entirely. It was hard to imagine anyone wanting to spend time here, but I'd seen worse places being used as shelter. As I got closer, I noticed something that made me pause. There were no sounds coming from inside the cabin, no voices, no movement. Not even the normal sounds of someone maintaining a fire. The smoke was still rising steadily from the chimney, but the place felt abandoned. I reached the front of the cabin and called out, "Hello, Park Service. Anyone in there?" No answer. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. The door was hanging slightly ajar, and I could see a faint glow from inside. The fire, presumably. I pushed the door open wider and peered in. "Hello? This is the Park Service. I need to speak with whoever's in here." The silence that greeted me was absolute. But what I saw in that dim interior made my blood run cold, and I knew immediately that this wasn't going to be a routine eviction. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Metallic and sharp, it cut through the woody scent of the fire and grabbed me by the throat. I'd smelled it before. Hunting accidents, car wrecks, the occasional suicide I'd had to help investigate. Blood. a lot of it. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped carefully into the cabin. The floor creaked under my boots, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I registered that the boards felt sticky. The fire in the stone fireplace was burning low but steady, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the small space with a hellish orange glow. The cabin's interior was a disaster. Furniture that had probably been there for decades was overturned and smashed. A wooden table lay in splinters near the far wall, and an old iron bed frame was twisted into an impossible angle. Broken dishes and scattered belongings covered the floor, but it was the dark stains that drew my attention. Blood covered everything. It wasn't just splattered, it was smeared, as if something had dragged wet bodies across the floor. The wooden walls were painted with it in long, deliberate strokes that looked almost like some kind of primitive artwork. My flashlight beam caught pools of it that had soaked into the floorboards, creating black patches that squelched underfoot. I had seen my share of violence in the year I'd been working these mountains. Domestic disputes that ended badly, hunting accidents, even a murder-suicide in one of the remote camping areas. But nothing like this. This looked like a slaughter. I keyed my radio again. "Base, this is Morrison. I need immediate backup and a medical unit at my location. We have a possible multiple homicide." Static answered me, then nothing. I tried different channels, adjusting the squelch, even removing the battery and reseating it. The radio was dead. Not just poor reception, completely dead. That was when I noticed the claw marks. Near the fireplace, gouged deep into the wood, were scratches that looked like they'd been made by something with claws the size of railroad spikes. The marks were fresh, the wood inside them still pale and raw. They ran in parallel lines, 4 of them, each about as long as my forearm. Whatever had made them had put considerable force behind the effort. I knelt beside the marks, running my flashlight beam along them. They were too big for a bear, too deep for a bobcat, and too clean for any tool I could think of. The spacing was wrong, too. Too wide to be human, even if someone had been using some kind of claw-like weapon. As I examined the scratches, I heard something that made my skin crawl. A low, rumbling sound, like the growl of a very large dog, but deeper. It seemed to come from outside the cabin, somewhere in the tree line. I froze, straining to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. The growl came again, closer this time. It was answered by another sound, higher pitched, almost like a whine. There was something out there, and it wasn't alone. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. My hand went instinctively to my radio, but I already knew it was useless. The nearest backup was at least an hour away, assuming they'd even received my first transmission. I was on my own. The smart thing to do would be to get out of the cabin and back to my vehicle, then drive until I found a working radio or reached a phone. But as I turned toward the door, I saw something that stopped me cold. Fresh blood was still dripping from the mantel above the fireplace, falling into the flames with tiny hisses of steam. Whatever had happened here, it had happened recently. Very recently. I swept my flashlight beam around the room again, looking for any sign of victims or survivors. The blood was everywhere, but I didn't see any bodies. That could mean the victims had been taken somewhere else, or... Another growl, this one much closer. It sounded like it was right outside the cabin door. I backed towards the rear of the cabin, where a small window looked out onto the forest. The glass was gone, leaving just a rectangular opening barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. As I approached it, I heard movement outside, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I clicked off my flashlight and peered through the window. The forest was dark under the overcast sky, but I could make out shapes moving between the trees, big shapes. Too big to be deer or bear, and moving with a purpose that made my mouth go dry. Whatever was out there, it was hunting. I gripped my flashlight like a weapon and tried to think. The window was small, but I might be able to get through it if I had to. My radio was dead, but if I could get back to my truck, I had a CB radio that might work. The problem was that my truck was parked about a quarter-mile away, and I'd have to cross open ground to reach it. As I debated my options, I heard the front door of the cabin creak open. Something was coming inside. I pressed myself against the wall next to the window and held my breath. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor, but they didn't sound right. They were too soft, too padded, like something with large paws instead of feet. The steps were accompanied by a wet, snuffling sound, like a dog following a scent. A shadow passed in front of the fireplace, blocking some of the light. In the brief glimpse I got, I saw something that made my knees weak. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, but hunched over like it was too heavy to stand fully upright. Its silhouette was all wrong, too long in the arms, too narrow in the waist, with something that looked like a mane or thick fur around its neck and shoulders. The thing moved through the cabin slowly, methodically, as if it was searching for something or someone. I heard it sniff the air, a sound like a bellows being worked. Then it made a sound I'll never forget, a low, rumbling vocalization that was part growl, part moan, and entirely inhuman. It had found my scent. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I grabbed the window frame and hauled myself through, scraping my shoulders against the rough wood. I dropped to the ground outside and ran, abandoning any thought of stealth. Behind me, I heard the thing let out a roar that seemed to shake the trees. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face and roots trying to trip me. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, creating a strobe effect that made the trees seem to dance around me. I could hear the thing behind me, moving through the underbrush with surprising speed for something its size. The trail back to my truck seemed impossibly long. Every shadow looked like a predator, every sound like pursuit. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but I kept running. The alternative was unthinkable. I reached my truck and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. The engine turned over on the second try, and I floored it, sending gravel flying as I tore down the service road. In my rearview mirror, I saw something emerge from the tree line. It stood at the edge of the road, watching me go, and in the red glow of my taillights, I got a clear look at it for the first time. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, and nothing I ever wanted to see again. The creature stood at least 7 feet tall, but its posture was all wrong, hunched forward like it was built for moving on all fours, but had learned to walk upright. Its skin was a mottled gray-brown like wet bark, but covered in patches of coarse, dark fur that seemed to shift and move in the wind. The arms were impossibly long, hanging past its knees, ending in hands that looked more like the talons of some enormous bird of prey. But it was the face that would haunt my dreams for years to come. It was canine, but wrong, elongated and predatory, with a muzzle full of teeth, and the gleamed white in my taillights. The eyes were the worst part. They reflected the light like a cat's, but there was an intelligence there, a calculating awareness that made my blood freeze. The thing watched me drive away with what looked like patience, as if it knew I'd be back. Or maybe it was just deciding whether I was worth pursuing. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I drove hard down the mountain, pushing my truck faster than was safe on the narrow, winding road. The CB radio crackled to life as I got closer to the main park facilities, and I grabbed the mic with shaking hands. Any unit. This is Park Ranger Morrison. I have an emergency situation at the old hunter's cabin on North Ridge. Multiple casualties, Possible fatalities. I need immediate backup and medical assistance." The response came back garbled, but I could make out enough to know that help was on the way. I was told to meet the other units at the ranger station, where I could give a full report. I agreed, though I wasn't sure how I was going to explain what I'd seen. The ranger station was a small building at the intersection of two service roads, built in the 1960s when the park was still figuring out how to manage the increasing number of visitors. It served as a dispatch center, equipment storage, and meeting place for the rangers who worked the remote areas. When I pulled up, there were already 3 other vehicles there, 2 park service trucks, and a county sheriff's car. Inside, I found Ranger Tom Bradley, who supervised our section, along with Deputies Miller and Kowalski from the local sheriff's department. They'd been waiting for me, and the looks on their faces told me they were expecting bad news. "Jesus, Morrison, you look like you've seen a ghost," Bradley said. "What happened out there?" I sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs around the conference table and tried to organize my thoughts. How do you explain something that shouldn't exist? How do you describe a creature that looks like it stepped out of a nightmare? "There's been an attack at the old hunter's cabin," I said finally. "Multiple victims from the looks of it. The place is covered in blood, and there are signs of a struggle. No bodies that I could see, but—" "But what?" Deputy Miller asked. He was young, probably fresh out of the academy, and he had that eager look that cops get when they think they're about to solve a big case. "The thing that did it was still there when I arrived, and it's not human." The room went quiet. Bradley leaned back in his chair and studied me with the kind of look you give someone who might be having a breakdown. "Not human," he said slowly. "What exactly does that mean?" I told them about the claw marks, the way the creature moved, the inhuman sounds it made. I described its appearance as best I could, though I knew how it sounded. The more I talked, the more skeptical he looked. "You're talking about some kind of animal," Deputy Kowalski said. "Maybe a bear that got into the cabin, scared some campers." "It wasn't a bear," I said. "I know what a bear looks like. This was something else entirely." "Could it have been a person in some kind of costume?" Bradley asked. "Maybe someone on drugs, acting erratically?" I shook my head. "Tom, you know me. I've been working these mountains for over a year. I'm not some rookie who panics at the first sign of trouble. What I saw wasn't human, and it sure as hell wasn't a bear." They exchanged glances. I could see them trying to decide whether I was lying, delusional, or just badly shaken up by whatever I'd encountered. "All right," Bradley said finally. "We'll go take a look. But first, I need you to mark the location on the map and give us a detailed description of exactly what you saw inside the cabin." I spent the next hour going over every detail I could remember: the blood, the destroyed furniture, the claw marks, the way the creature moved. They took notes, asked questions, and gradually began to accept that something serious had happened, even if they weren't ready to believe my description of what had caused it. By the time we'd finished, it was getting dark. Bradley made the decision to wait until morning to investigate the cabin, which suited me fine. I had no desire to go back to that place in the dark, and I had a feeling that whatever was out there would be more active after sunset. I drove home to my small apartment in Gatlinburg, but I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face looking back at me from the tree line. I kept thinking about the intelligence in those eyes, the way it had watched me leave. It had been studying me, learning about me, and that thought made my skin crawl. The next morning I met Bradley and the deputies at the ranger station. We loaded up with additional equipment, cameras, evidence bags, and more powerful radios. Bradley had also brought his sidearm, which made me feel slightly better about returning to the cabin. The drive up the mountain was quiet. Everyone was tense, though I suspected the others were more worried about what we might find than what we might encounter. They were thinking about human victims, crime scenes, and paperwork. I was thinking about claws and teeth and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. When we reached the end of the service road, we hiked the last quarter-mile to the cabin. The forest seemed different in daylight, less threatening, more ordinary. Birds were singing, insects were buzzing, and the whole place had the normal sounds of a healthy woodland ecosystem. It was hard to believe that something so alien could exist in such a familiar environment. The cabin looked different, too. In the harsh light of day, it was just a run-down building falling apart in the woods. The smoke was no longer rising from the chimney, and the windows stared out at us like dead eyes. Bradley approached the door first, his hand resting on his gun. He called out, just as I had the day before, and got the same response: silence. When he pushed open the door, I heard him curse under his breath. The others crowded behind him, and I saw their faces change as they took in the scene. "Jesus Christ," Deputy Miller whispered. "What the hell happened here?" But as I looked over their shoulders into the cabin, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The blood was gone. The broken furniture was gone. The claw marks were gone. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years, covered in dust and cobwebs, with no sign that anyone had been there recently. It was as if the previous day had never happened at all. "This is the place," I said, pushing past Bradley to enter the cabin. "This is where it happened." But even as I said it, I could hear the doubt in my own voice. The interior of the cabin was completely different from what I'd seen the day before. Instead of the charnel house I'd described, we found a tired old building slowly being reclaimed by nature. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows, and spider webs stretched across the corners where they'd clearly been undisturbed for months. The wooden floors were dry and gray with age, showing no sign of the pools of blood I'd waded through. The furniture, what little remained, was arranged normally, though covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. The stone fireplace was cold and had obviously been unused for a long time, with old ashes and leaves scattered across the hearth. "Morrison," Bradley said quietly. "This place hasn't been used in years." I walked to the spot where I'd seen the claw marks, running my hands along the wood beside the fireplace. The surface was smooth and weathered, marked only by the normal wear of decades of neglect. There was no sign of the deep gouges I'd seen the day before. "I don't understand," I said, more to myself than to the others. "It was here. The blood, the damage, it was all here." Deputy Miller was taking photographs, though there wasn't much to document. Deputy Kowalski was examining the floor with a magnifying glass, looking for any trace of blood or other evidence. Bradley stood near the door, watching me with an expression that mixed concern with growing suspicion. "Are you sure this is the right cabin?" he asked. "Maybe in your, excitement yesterday, you got turned around." I knew he was trying to be diplomatic, but I could hear what he was really thinking. He thought I'd had some kind of breakdown, that I'd imagined the whole thing. Part of me was starting to wonder if he was right. "This is the place," I said firmly. "I know these woods like the back of my hand. This is definitely the cabin." But even as I said it, I was questioning myself. The human mind can play tricks, especially under stress. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? The creature in the tree line, the blood-soaked interior, the claw marks. Could it all have been some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and isolation? "We should check the surrounding area," I said. "Look for tracks, disturbances in the vegetation, anything that might support what I reported." We spent the next 2 hours combing through the forest around the cabin. The deputies were thorough, I'll give them credit for that. They checked for footprints, broken branches, blood splatters, anything that might indicate violence or the presence of a large predator. Bradley and I searched a wider perimeter, looking for any sign of the creature I'd described. We found nothing. The forest floor was undisturbed except for the normal signs of small animals: deer tracks, squirrel scratches on tree bark, the occasional bird dropping. There was no evidence of a struggle, no sign of any large predator, and certainly no trace of the monster I'd claimed to have seen. By noon, it was clear that the search was over. The others were trying to be polite about it, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought I'd cracked under the pressure of working alone in the wilderness, that I'd let my imagination run wild, and created a fantasy to explain some ordinary occurrence. "Maybe you saw a bear," Bradley suggested as we walked back to the vehicles. "It's been a lean year for them, and they're getting bolder about investigating human activity. In the dim light of the cabin, with the stress of the situation, it would be easy to misinterpret what you were seeing." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I'd seen was real, but I was beginning to doubt myself. The evidence was overwhelming, or rather, the lack of evidence was overwhelming. How could a scene of such violence simply disappear overnight? How could blood that had soaked into wooden floorboards vanish without a trace? "Yeah," I said finally. "Maybe it was a bear." But I didn't believe it, and I could tell from Bradley's expression that he knew I didn't believe it. He was worried about me, I realized. Worried that one of his rangers was having psychological problems that might affect his ability to do the job. The ride back to the ranger station was quiet. I sat in the passenger seat of Bradley's truck, staring out at the forest and trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I really imagined the whole thing? The blood, the creature, the chase through the woods. Had it all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination? But I could still smell the metallic scent of blood, still hear the creature's inhuman growl, still feel the terror that had driven me to flee through the forest. Those memories were too vivid, too detailed to be fantasy. I knew what I'd experienced, even if I couldn't prove it. At the station, Bradley took me aside for a private conversation. He was gentle about it, but firm. "Morrison, I'm going to recommend that you take some time off," he said. "A week, maybe 2. Get some rest, maybe talk to someone about what you're experiencing. The job can be stressful, especially working alone in remote areas for extended periods." I wanted to object, to insist that I was fine, but I could see that his mind was made up, and honestly, part of me was relieved. The thought of going back into those woods, of potentially encountering that creature again, filled me with dread. "All right," I said. "I'll take some time off, but Tom, I need you to understand something. What I saw was real. I know how it sounds. I know there's no evidence, but it was real." He nodded, but I could see he didn't believe me. None of them did. In their minds, I was a good ranger who'd had a bad experience and needed some help getting back on track. The official report would probably describe an encounter with a bear or other wildlife that had been exaggerated by stress and poor lighting conditions. That afternoon, I cleaned out my desk at the station and turned in my radio and other equipment. The other rangers were polite but distant, and I could see them exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Word had gotten around about what had happened, and I was now the ranger who'd had a breakdown in the woods. I drove home to my apartment, but I didn't stay there. Instead, I packed a bag and drove to a motel in Cherokee, North Carolina, on the other side of the park. I needed to be away from the mountains for a while, away from the endless green forests and the shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even in the motel room, with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, I felt exposed. I kept thinking about the intelligence in those eyes, the way the creature had studied me before I fled. It had seen me, learned about me, and somehow I didn't think it was done with me yet. I started carrying a gun. I had a .38 revolver that I'd inherited from my grandfather, and I got a permit to carry it concealed. It wasn't much against something the size of what I'd encountered, but it made me feel slightly more secure. The nightmares started that first night in the motel. I dreamed about the cabin, about the blood, and the claw marks, and the creature's eyes reflecting light like mirrors. I dreamed about being chased through endless forests, always just one step ahead of something that wanted to tear me apart. I woke up screaming more than once, and I could tell from the looks I got in the motel's breakfast area that other guests had heard me. After a week, I moved to a different motel, then another. I was running from something I couldn't name, something that existed only in my memories and nightmares. But I couldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face looking back at me from the tree line. And I knew, somehow I knew, that it was still out there, still waiting. 2 weeks after my suspension, I received a call from Bradley. His voice was tight, professional, but I could hear the underlying tension. "Morrison, I need you to come in. We need to talk." I'd been staying at a motel in Knoxville, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the mountains. The city noise helped mask the sounds that weren't really there, the growls and footsteps that seemed to follow me even in my sleep. "What's going on, Tom?" "Just come in. We'll discuss it when you get here." The drive back to the park felt like returning to a place that had been contaminated somehow. The closer I got to the mountains, the more anxious I became. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the ranger station, and I had to sit in my truck for several minutes before I could force myself to go inside. Bradley was waiting for me, along with Deputy Miller and a man I didn't recognize, older, wearing a suit that looked out of place in the rustic setting of the ranger station. "Morrison, this is Agent Harrison from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation," Bradley said. "He has some questions about your report from 2 weeks ago." Harrison was a thin man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. He studied me with the kind of professional attention that made me uncomfortable. "Ranger Morrison," he said, "I've read your report about the incident at the hunter's cabin. I'd like to hear your account again, in your own words." I told the story again, leaving out nothing. The blood, the claw marks, the creature in the tree line. As I spoke, I watched their faces, seeing the same skepticism I'd encountered before. But there was something else, something that hadn't been there in my earlier debriefings. When I finished, Harrison leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "Ranger Morrison, are you aware that 3 people have been reported missing in the area where you claim to have had this encounter?" My blood went cold. "Missing?" "A family of 3, parents and their teenage daughter, went camping in the backcountry about 2 weeks ago. They were supposed to return last Sunday, but they never checked out. Their campsite was found abandoned with signs of a struggle." I felt the room spinning slightly. "What kind of signs?" "Torn tents, scattered equipment, blood on the vegetation, the kind of scene you might expect if they'd been attacked by a large predator." Harrison paused. "Or by something else." Deputy Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The thing is, Morrison, there's no wildlife in these mountains that could do that kind of damage. Fish and Wildlife came in, did a full investigation. They found evidence of an attack, but they can't identify what might have caused it." "The blood work came back human," Harrison added. "All 3 victims, based on the DNA analysis, but there's something else. The attack patterns, the way the scene was disturbed, it doesn't match any known predator." I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. "You believe me?" "I believe something happened out there," Harrison said carefully. "Something that left 3 people dead or missing and created a scene that has investigators baffled. Your report, despite its unusual nature, is the only eyewitness account we have of anything anomalous in that area. Bradley leaned forward. Morrison, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Is there anything else you remember about that day? Anything you might have left out of your original report? I thought back to that day, to the terror and confusion of my encounter with the creature. There was something I'd been trying not to think about. The radio, I said slowly. My radio went dead when I was in the cabin, not just poor reception. Completely dead. And it worked fine once I got away from the area. Harrison and Bradley exchanged glances. What do you mean, exactly? I mean, the radio was functioning normally when I arrived at the cabin. I used it to call for backup, but once I got inside and discovered the blood, it wouldn't work at all. No static, no signal, nothing, like something was jamming it. That's interesting, Harrison said, because the missing family's cell phones were found at their campsite, and they'd all malfunctioned simultaneously. The tech said they'd never seen anything like it. The phones were physically undamaged, but their electronics were completely fried. The room was quiet for a long moment. I could feel them all staring at me, and I realized that for the first time since my encounter, someone was taking my story seriously. There's something else, I said. When I saw the creature in the tree line, when it was watching me drive away, it wasn't just an animal. There was intelligence there. It was thinking, planning, learning. Whatever it is, it's smart. Harrison nodded slowly. That matches what we found at the campsite. The attack was organized, methodical. Not the kind of random violence you'd expect from a wild animal. So what are you saying, I asked? That there's something out there that's hunting people? I'm saying that 3 people are dead or missing, and you're the only person who claims to have seen what might be responsible. Harrison stood up. I'm also saying that I want you to come with me to the campsite where the family disappeared. I want you to see if you recognize anything, if there are similarities to what you experience. Every instinct I had screamed at me to refuse. The last thing I wanted was to go back into those woods to risk another encounter with whatever I'd seen. But I also knew that if I didn't help, more people might die. All right, I said. I'll go. The campsite was about 5 miles from the hunter's cabin, in a remote area that required a 2-hour hike from the nearest road. As we walked through the forest, I found myself constantly scanning the trees, looking for movement, listening for sounds that didn't belong. When we reached the site, I understood why the investigators had been baffled. The scene was eerily similar to what I'd found in the cabin, evidence of tremendous violence, but with disturbing inconsistencies. The family's tent had been shredded, but not randomly. The tears were precise, almost surgical, as if something with very sharp claws had opened the fabric with deliberate care. Their equipment was scattered, but not in the chaotic pattern you'd expect from a panicked escape. Instead, it looked like their belongings had been examined, sorted, arranged. It was searching for something, I said, studying the scene. Or learning about them. Harrison nodded. That's what we thought, too. But searching for what? I didn't have an answer. But as I looked at the evidence of the family's last moments, I felt the same chill I'd experienced in the cabin. Whatever had done this was still out there, and it was getting bolder. We spent the rest of the day at the campsite, with Harrison asking me to describe anything that seemed familiar or unusual. As the sun began to set, we prepared to hike back to our vehicles. I was eager to get out of the woods before dark, remembering how the creature had seemed more active in the shadows. We were about halfway back to the road when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from all around us. Harrison and Deputy Miller froze, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. What was that? Miller whispered. I didn't answer. I was too busy scanning the trees, looking for the source of the sound. It came again, closer this time, and I saw something that made my blood freeze. Eyes, reflecting our flashlight beams from the darkness between the trees. Not one pair, but several. They were watching us, studying us, just as I'd been watched that day at the cabin. "We need to leave," I said quietly. "Now." But as we started moving toward the road, I heard the sound of movement in the forest around us. Heavy bodies moving through the underbrush, keeping pace with us but staying hidden. We were being escorted, herded, like prey being driven toward a trap. "Run," I said, and we did. I never went back to work as a park ranger. After that night, after Harrison and Miller corroborated my story, after the TBI launched a full investigation that was quietly classified and buried, I knew I couldn't return to those woods. The official report listed the missing family as victims of a bear attack, despite the evidence to the contrary. Harrison tried to keep the investigation open, but pressure from above forced him to close the case. Some things, I learned, are too dangerous to acknowledge officially. I moved to Florida, about as far from the mountains as I could get, while staying in the continental United States. I work security at a shopping mall now, which isn't exactly what I'd planned for my career, but it pays the bills and keeps me around people and artificial light. I still carry a gun, though I've upgraded to something with more stopping power. I tell people it's because I work security, but the truth is, I've never forgotten those eyes in the darkness, the intelligence behind them, the sense that I was being hunted. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about the mountains. I dream about creatures moving through the forest, learning about the people who visit their domain, planning. In those dreams, I sometimes wonder if my encounter was just the beginning, if what I saw was just the advance scout for something larger. But then I wake up, and the Florida sun is streaming through my windows, and I can hear the normal sounds of civilization, traffic, air conditioners, human voices. I tell myself it was all just stress, isolation, and overactive imagination. Most of the time, I almost believe it. But I still check the locks on my doors every night, and I still sleep with my gun within reach. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, I remember those eyes watching me from the tree line. And I know that whatever I saw in the Smoky Mountains isn't finished with me yet. It's still out there waiting. And someday, it might come looking for me.